Most people stop investing the moment life becomes uncertain. But the Bible reveals something shocking. Isaac became dramatically richer during a famine, not after it ended. This principle is confirmed by Joseph, King Solomon, and Jesus Christ. Across generations, the message is the same. Those who keep sowing in difficult times are the ones who experience multiplication. Stay with me until the end, and you will discover why fear causes most people to consume their future. How to apply this biblical wealth principle in your own finances, and how disciplined faith can turn today's uncertainty into tomorrow's hundredfold harvest. There was a moment in Isaac's life when every visible sign pointed in one direction: retreat. The land was in famine. Crops were failing. Resources were shrinking. Anxiety was spreading from household to household. Men who had once felt secure were suddenly calculating how many weeks of grain remained. Families began preparing to leave, convinced that survival depended on finding greener fields somewhere else. From a human perspective, the decision seemed obvious. Preserve what little you have, stop taking risks, protect your seed, wait until conditions improve. That is exactly what most people do when they face financial pressure. They stop investing, they stop building, they stop sowing. Fear whispers that this is wisdom. But God gave Isaac an instruction that defied every instinct of self-preservation. Stay, do not run to Egypt, remain in the land I show you. This was more than a geographical command. It was a test of trust. Would Isaac allow visible scarcity to determine his actions, or would he move according to a promise greater than what his eyes could see? Then Isaac did something that appeared irrational. He sowed. He took valuable seeds, something that could have been eaten, stored, or hidden, and placed it into dry ground during a season of uncertainty. To the natural mind, this looked reckless. To heaven, it looked like faith. Because faith is not pretending, problems do not exist. Faith is acting on God's instruction even when circumstances suggest the opposite. Isaac understood a principle that would later echo through all of Scripture. The future belongs to those who continue planting when others are paralyzed by fear. The famine was real. The risk was real. But the promise of God was more real than both. And in that moment, Isaac proved that prosperity does not begin when conditions become favorable. It begins when a person trusts God enough to keep sowing in the middle of scarcity. The greatest financial losses are not always caused by bad investments. More often, they are caused by interrupted obedience. A person begins with vision. They save consistently. They invest in their skills. They build a business. They plant seeds that, given enough time, could transform their future. Progress is slow at first, but that is the nature of all meaningful growth. Roots form long before fruit appears. Then pressure arrives. The economy weakens. Expenses increase, unexpected bills appear, markets become volatile, doubt begins to speak louder than conviction. And this is the moment where most people make the decision that quietly changes the course of their lives. They stop sowing. They stop contributing to investments. They stop funding the business they were building. They stop learning. They stop creating. They consume the very seeds that were meant to produce tomorrow's harvest. On the surface, this feels prudent. It feels responsible. It feels like survival. But beneath the surface, something dangerous is happening. Fear has taken control of strategy. Fear is persuasive because it speaks in the language of protection. It tells you that once conditions improve, you can begin again. It promises that pausing today will not matter in the long run. But time is the hidden partner in every harvest. When you stop sowing, you do not merely lose money. You break momentum, you interrupt compounding. You delay outcomes that require consistency more than intensity. This is why so many people work hard for decades and still feel as though they are starting over. They plant for a season, panic when uncertainty appears, and uproot the process before the roots mature. Then they wonder why others seem to advance while they remain stuck. The difference is rarely intelligence. It is continuity. The people who build enduring wealth are not those who avoid all difficulties. They are those who maintain disciplined action when circumstances become uncomfortable. This principle appears throughout Scripture. Joseph continued storing grain during years of abundance because he trusted that preparation would matter later. King Solomon taught that the diligent prosper because they keep working with patience rather than reacting impulsively. Jesus Christ praised the servants who multiplied what they had been given instead of hiding it in fear. And Isaac sowed in famine. The pattern is unmistakable. Faithful people keep planting, not because they ignore risk, but because they understand that withdrawing completely can become the greatest risk of all. Every seed carries delayed potential. Every disciplined act of saving, investing, learning, and building contains a future that cannot be seen immediately. The temptation to stop usually appears just before the benefits of persistence begin to emerge. That is why most people quit too soon. They mistake temporary discomfort for permanent failure. They allow visible scarcity to cancel invisible growth. But prosperity belongs to those who refuse to let fear consume their seed. They continue to sow, trusting that what is planted in wisdom and sustained by faith will eventually produce a harvest far greater than the sacrifice required to plant it. Long before the famine arrived, Joseph had already begun preparing for it. That is what made him different. Most people only become disciplined after pressure appears. They begin saving when money becomes scarce. They start planning when uncertainty is already at the door. They seek wisdom only after the consequences of disorder become impossible to ignore. Joseph worked in the opposite direction. While Egypt was experiencing extraordinary abundance, while the fields were overflowing and the population was celebrating prosperity, Joseph saw beyond the visible moment. God had revealed that 7 years of plenty would be followed by 7 years of severe famine. This revelation changed everything. Joseph understood that abundance is not permission to relax. It is an opportunity to prepare. That insight remains one of the most powerful financial principles in all of Scripture. The wise do not consume everything they receive. They convert seasons of blessing into reserves for future stability. Instead of treating prosperity as a reason to increase spending, Joseph treated it as a responsibility to build margin. Genesis records that he collected 1/5 of the harvest and stored it systematically throughout the nation, 20%, a fixed percentage, a disciplined structure, not an emotional decision based on how he felt that month, not whatever happened to be left over. Joseph established order before crisis demanded it. This is the law of preparation. Set aside resources before you need them. Build reserves before conditions deteriorate. Create structure while there is still time to act calmly. This principle applies far beyond grain. Savings are stored time. Liquidity is stored flexibility. Knowledge is stored wisdom. Relationships are stored trust. Every intentional reserve becomes a source of strength when external conditions change. When the famine finally came, the difference between Joseph and everyone else became unmistakable. Others panicked. Joseph was positioned. Others were forced to react. Joseph was prepared to lead. People from surrounding nations traveled to Egypt because what had been stored during abundance became the foundation of survival during scarcity. Joseph did not merely protect himself. He became a channel of provision for entire nations, including his own family. That is the deeper purpose of biblical prosperity. God does not increase resources solely for personal comfort. He increases them so that faithful stewards can preserve life, serve others, and sustain divine purpose. Preparation turns private discipline into public influence. This is why prosperity always begins with vision. If you cannot see beyond the current season, you will consume what should have been conserved. If you believe good times will last forever, you will spend the seed needed for tomorrow. If you assume provision will always be immediate, you will never develop the habits that create resilience. Joseph saw what others could not. He understood that the future rewards those who prepare before necessity becomes urgent. In practical terms, this means saving during periods of strong income, reducing unnecessary spending when life feels comfortable, investing in skills before they become essential, and maintaining liquidity while opportunities are still optional rather than desperate. Preparation is an act of faith. It declares that God's warnings matter. It acknowledges that seasons change. It honors the resources entrusted to you. Most importantly, it transforms prosperity from a temporary experience into a lasting system. Joseph's life proves that wealth is not built in the crisis itself. The crisis only reveals who prepared. When difficult times arrive, some people discover they have nothing stored. Others discover that years of disciplined stewardship have created peace, stability, and influence. The difference is not luck. The difference is preparation. And that is Joseph's enduring law. When God gives you abundance, do not waste it. Organize it. Protect it. Reserve it. Because the resources you preserve today may become the very instrument God uses to sustain you and to bless many others tomorrow. King Solomon did not become the wealthiest ruler of his age by chasing money. He became wealthy because he understood structure. Most people focus on income. They ask how to earn more, how to find the next opportunity, how to increase cash flow. Solomon looked deeper. He understood that wealth is not determined only by what comes in. It is determined by the architecture that governs what remains, what multiplies, and what survives. This is why so many people experience periods of abundance and yet never achieve lasting financial peace. They build income without building structure, and anything built without structure eventually collapses under its own weight. Solomon's writings return repeatedly to three foundational principles: diligence, balance, and stewardship. Diligence is the first pillar. Proverbs teaches that the diligent hand makes rich. This does not refer to frantic activity or endless busyness. It describes consistent, intentional effort directed towards something productive. Diligence is focused labor applied with patience over time. The diligent person keeps planting. The diligent person keeps learning. The diligent person keeps refining systems that become stronger with repetition. Wealth grows where disciplined action is repeated long enough for compounding to take effect. But diligence alone is not enough. Without balance, hard work can create fragility. Solomon understood that concentration without margin is dangerous. When all resources are committed to one venture, one market, or one source of income, a single disruption can threaten everything. That is why biblical wisdom consistently emphasizes diversification, reserve, and measured deployment. Some assets provide stability. Some produce growth. Some remain liquid so they can be used when opportunity or crisis appears. Balance protects both against greed and against fear. Greed pushes people to overextend. Fear causes them to hoard. Wisdom creates boundaries that prevent both extremes. This is Solomon's second pillar. The third pillar is stewardship. Solomon never viewed wealth as personal ownership in the ultimate sense. Resources were entrusted by God and were to be managed faithfully. Money was not an identity. It was a responsibility. That perspective changes everything. A steward does not waste. A steward does not gamble recklessly. A steward does not consume everything that enters his hands. A steward organizes, protects, and multiplies what has been entrusted to him. Under this model, prosperity becomes more than accumulation. It becomes resilience. Resilient wealth can withstand economic downturns, unexpected losses, and generational transitions because it is rooted in principles rather than circumstances. This is why some families build assets that endure, while others repeatedly start from zero. The enduring families establish systems. They maintain discipline in prosperous seasons. They preserve margin. They transmit wisdom to the next generation. Solomon's greatest financial insight is that wealth is not merely about having more. It is about becoming harder to break. When diligence drives growth, balance reduces vulnerability. and stewardship aligns resources with purpose, prosperity becomes durable. It survives beyond a single business cycle, beyond a single career, beyond a single lifetime. That is Solomon's architecture of resilient wealth. Build patiently, maintain balance, manage faithfully. And over time, what begins as disciplined obedience becomes a structure strong enough to endure changing markets, uncertain seasons, and the inevitable tests that come to every generation. When Jesus Christ told the parable of the talents, he was not merely teaching about money. He was revealing a universal law of multiplication. In the story, a master prepares to travel and entrusts his servants with resources according to their capacity. One receives 5 talents, another 2, and another 1. The amounts are different, but the expectation is the same. Each servant is responsible for what has been placed in his hands. The first 2 servants act immediately. They invest. They take responsibility. They put the entrusted resources to work. When the master returns, both have doubled what they received. Their reward is striking. The master does not praise their intelligence, their luck, or their market timing. He praises their faithfulness. Well done, good and faithful servant. This reveals one of the most important principles in biblical prosperity. God measures stewardship before expansion. The ability to multiply begins with the willingness to manage faithfully what you already possess. Then the story turns. The third servant takes a different approach. Fear governs his decision. He hides the talent in the ground. He protects it from risk. He avoids visible loss. And yet, when the master returns, this servant receives the strongest rebuke. Why? Because preservation without productive action is not faithfulness. It is paralysis disguised as caution. The servant believed that avoiding risk was enough. Jesus teaches that it is not. What is buried does not grow. What is hidden cannot multiply. What is governed by fear eventually diminishes. This is the law of multiplication. Resources increase when they are placed into productive use. They stagnate when they are immobilized. They are lost when fear prevents action. This principle applies to far more than money. Skills multiply when they are developed. Knowledge multiplies when it is applied. Relationships multiply when they are cultivated. Capital multiplies when it is invested with wisdom. Every gift entrusted by God carries the expectation of increase, and that expectation is rooted in faith. Faith is not reckless speculation. Faith is the courage to act responsibly despite uncertainty. The first 2 servants did not have guarantees. They had trust. They understood that stewardship required movement. The third servant wanted certainty before action. In doing so, he forfeited the very increase he hoped to preserve. This is precisely the principle seen in the lives of Isaac, Joseph, and King Solomon. Isaac sowed, Joseph stored and managed. Solomon structured and diversified. Jesus unified these patterns into one timeless lesson. What you faithfully manage will grow. What you fearfully bury will diminish. The law of multiplication is not reserved for a select few. It is available to every person willing to steward resources with discipline, patience, and trust in God. And the invitation remains the same today. Do not bury what has been entrusted to you. Put it to work, multiply it, and discover that faith, when joined with wise action, transforms even small beginnings into abundant harvests. Then came the moment that transformed Isaac's obedience into undeniable evidence. The famine had not disappeared. The skies had not suddenly changed. The surrounding conditions were still harsh. The same dry land that caused others to retreat remained before him. The same uncertainty that convinced many to preserve rather than plant still covered the region. And yet, Scripture records one of the most extraordinary financial outcomes in the entire Bible. Isaac sowed in that land and reaped 100-fold in the same year, 100 times what he planted, not eventually, not after conditions became ideal. In the very year of famine. This is the part that challenges the assumptions most people carry about prosperity. We tend to believe abundance is the natural result of favorable circumstances. We imagine that wealth is built only when markets are strong, opportunities are obvious, and uncertainty is low. But Isaac's story reveals a different reality. The greatest abundance often emerges in seasons when others are too afraid to act. Why? Because crisis changes behavior. When fear spreads, competition decreases. Assets become undervalued. Opportunities appear that are invisible to those focused only on survival. The same environment that paralyzes the majority can become a season of extraordinary multiplication for the person who remains disciplined and obedient. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout history. Joseph rose to power during famine. King Solomon built enduring wealth through structure and wisdom. Jesus Christ taught that faithful stewardship leads to increase, and Isaac became very wealthy because he continued sowing when logic said to stop. The hundredfold harvest was not random. It was the visible consequence of invisible consistency. Isaac trusted the promise of God more than the appearance of the land. He treated the famine as a context, not as a verdict. That distinction changes everything. Circumstances describe the present. They do not determine the future. The future is shaped by what you continue to plant despite present uncertainty. This does not mean every seed produces immediate results. It means that obedience positions you where multiplication can occur. Some people spend difficult seasons protecting what remains. Others use those same seasons to establish foundations that will define the next decade of their lives. When conditions eventually improve, the second group is already far ahead because they planted while others hesitated. That is the secret behind Isaac's hundredfold harvest. He did not wait for certainty. He moved in faith. And God multiplied what fear would have consumed. The lesson is profound. Your greatest breakthrough may not come after the crisis ends. It may come because you chose to remain faithful during the crisis. When you continue to sow with wisdom, discipline, and trust, scarcity can become the very environment where God produces abundance far beyond what human logic thought possible. The principle that transformed Isaac's future is not confined to ancient history. It remains available today. The form of the seed may have changed, but the law has not. Your seed may be money set aside each month. It may be a business you are building after work. It may be a new skill, an investment, a disciplined budget, or time devoted to developing something that can grow beyond your direct labor. Whatever form it takes, the principle is the same. Do not consume everything you receive. Plant a portion consistently. The first step is to identify your seed. What resource has God already placed in your hands that can be multiplied? Income, knowledge, relationships, creativity, and experience are all forms of capital. The second step is to establish a fixed percentage for sowing. Like Joseph, set aside a portion before you spend. The third step is to maintain reserves. Like King Solomon, build structure and liquidity so you can endure uncertainty and act when opportunity appears. The fourth step is to keep sowing during difficult seasons. Do not allow fear to consume the very seeds that were meant to produce your future. The fifth step is to pray for wisdom. Ask God not only for provision, but for discernment, patience, and discipline. Financial prosperity is not merely about earning more. It is about managing faithfully what has already been entrusted to you. And this is where the deepest transformation occurs. Money stops being a source of anxiety and becomes a tool of stewardship. Work becomes an act of purpose. Saving becomes an expression of faith. Investing becomes a form of obedience. Giving becomes a declaration of trust. Isaac sowed in famine. Joseph prepared in abundance. Solomon built with structure. Jesus taught multiplication through faithful stewardship. The message is clear. Keep planting. Keep building. Keep trusting. The conditions around you do not have the final word. God does. And when you continue to sow with wisdom and faith, the same Lord who multiplied Isaac's seed can turn today's disciplined obedience into a harvest that blesses your family, serves others, and glorifies Him for generations to come.